Sometimes the most profound moments in life arrive without warning, changing everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Love has a way of finding us, even when we've convinced ourselves we're better off alone. Mountain Man. Samuel Creek had lived in solitude for 15 years in the Colorado wilderness. His cabin sat miles from any settlement, surrounded by towering pines and endless silence. He chose this life deliberately. No attachments, no responsibilities beyond his own survival. On a bitter winter morning, a dying woman stumbled through his door, clutching 2 frightened children. Blood seeped through her dress as she collapsed, whispering her final plea, "Save my babies." Samuel looked into the terrified eyes of 8-year-old Emma and her 5-year-old brother Tommy. In that moment, he made a promise that would change all their lives forever. But how does a man who's forgotten how to love become a father in the deadliest frontier? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering pines that surrounded Samuel Creek's log cabin, their branches heavy with fresh snow from the previous night's storm. At 43, Samuel had carved out an existence in these Colorado mountains that suited him perfectly, predictable, solitary, and mercifully free from the complications that other people inevitably brought into a man's life. He rose before dawn every day, as he had for the past 15 years, moving through his morning routine with the precision of a man who had learned that structure was the difference between survival and surrender to the wilderness. The cast-iron stove crackled to life with practiced efficiency, and soon the rich aroma of coffee filled the single-room cabin that had become both his refuge and his fortress against a world that had disappointed him one too many times. Samuel's hands were weathered and scarred from countless encounters with axe handles, hunting knives, and the unforgiving bark of the pine trees he felled for firewood. His beard, now streaked with premature silver, covered a face that had once been quick to smile but had learned the hard lesson that smiles were often wasted on people who didn't deserve them. He stood 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and lean build of a man who earned his keep through physical labor and the constant vigilance required to live. Alone in territory where nature held all the cards, the cabin itself reflected Samuel's practical approach to life. Built with his own hands using timber from the surrounding forest, it measured 20 feet by 16 feet, large enough for one man's needs, small enough to heat efficiently during the brutal mountain winters. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney crafted from carefully selected rocks that Samuel had hauled from the creek bed a quarter-mile down the slope. The furniture was sparse but well made. A sturdy oak table he'd constructed during his second winter, 2 chairs that had seen better days but still held his weight, and a bed frame that supported a mattress stuffed with pine needles and covered with fur pelts from his hunting expeditions. Shelves lined the walls, filled with the necessities of mountain living, canned goods that he replenished twice a year during his reluctant trips to the settlement of Bear Creek, ammunition for his rifle and revolver, medical supplies that had saved his life more than once, and a collection of books that served as his only companions during the long winter evenings. The books were an eclectic mix: novels by Dickens and Cooper, a worn copy of the Bible that he rarely opened anymore, technical manuals on hunting and farming, and a leather-bound journal where he recorded weather patterns, animal migrations, and the scattered thoughts of a man who had too much time to think. Samuel's daily routine began with checking the animal traps he'd set the previous evening. Rabbit, squirrel, and the occasional deer provided most of his protein, supplemented by the fish he could catch from the creek during warmer months. He maintained a small garden during the brief growing season, coaxing potatoes, beans, and hardy vegetables from the rocky soil. Every aspect of his life required planning and preparation, a lesson he'd learned during his first winter when he'd nearly starved due to his own inexperience and overconfidence. The path to his chosen isolation hadn't been a straight one. Samuel Creek, though that wasn't the name he'd been born with, had once been a different man entirely. He'd had a wife, Sarah, whose laughter could fill a room, and whose gentle nature had convinced him that perhaps the world contained more good than he'd previously believed. They'd lived in a small house outside Denver, where Samuel had worked as a blacksmith and dreamed of building something lasting with the woman who'd captured his heart during a church social when he was 25, and still believed that good intentions were enough to protect the people you loved. Those dreams had died on a cold February morning when influenza took Sarah and their unborn child. Within a span of 3 days, Samuel had sat beside her bed, holding her fevered hand and making promises to God that he would later realize were worthless because some things in life couldn't be bargained with or fought against with determination and righteous anger. When the preacher had spoken at the funeral about God's plan and the mysterious ways of the Almighty, Samuel had walked away from the graveside and never looked back. The grief had nearly killed him during those first months. He'd sold the house, the blacksmith shop, and everything that reminded him of the life he'd lost. With the money, he'd bought supplies, tools, and the deed to 160 acres of mountain land that no one else wanted because it was too remote, too difficult, and too dangerous for sensible people to consider habitable. Samuel had seen it as perfect for his purposes, a place where he could disappear from a world that had proven itself capable of taking away everything that mattered without warning or justification. The first 5 years had been the hardest. Learning to hunt, to preserve meat, to predict weather patterns, and to treat his own injuries when accidents inevitably occurred. He'd broken his left arm during his 3rd winter when a tree limb gave way while he was clearing deadfall, and he'd set the bone himself using splints carved from pine branches and strips torn from an old shirt. The arm had healed crooked, leaving him with a slight bend that served as a permanent reminder of the cost of self-reliance. But gradually, Samuel had discovered something unexpected in his self-imposed exile: peace, not happiness. He wasn't sure he remembered what that felt like, but a deep, abiding peace that came from knowing exactly what each day would bring and having no one to disappoint or be disappointed by. He rose with the sun, worked until his body demanded rest, and slept the dreamless sleep of a man whose conscience was clear because he'd removed himself from all the situations where moral compromise might be required. The seasons became his calendar, and he marked time not by dates on a page, but by the arrival of wildflowers in spring, the peak heat of summer afternoons, the changing colors of aspen leaves in fall, and the first serious snowfall that would lock him into his cabin for months at a time. He learned the language of the wind through the pines, could predict storms by the behavior of birds and small animals, and developed an almost supernatural ability to move through the forest without disturbing its natural rhythms. Beneath the floorboards of his cabin, wrapped in oiled cloth and buried in a wooden box he'd crafted himself, lay the only remaining connection to the man he'd once been. The hand-carved wooden cross had belonged to his mother, passed down through 3 generations of Creek women who'd believed that faith could move mountains and protect the people they loved from harm. Samuel had buried it the day after Sarah's funeral, when he'd realized that all the prayers in the world hadn't been enough to save the most important person in his life. He told himself he kept the cross not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of the dangers of hope and the folly of believing that good intentions could shield anyone from life's inevitable cruelties. Yet on nights when the mountain wind howled through the pines and the cabin felt more like a tomb than a home, Samuel sometimes found himself thinking about that cross and wondering if there might still be some truth in the old promises his mother had whispered over his childhood injuries and fears. The morning of February 15th, 1876, began like any other. Samuel rose at 5:30, built up the fire, and put coffee on to brew while he pulled on his boots and heavy coat. The temperature had dropped to 20 below during the night, and frost covered the inside of his windows in delicate patterns that would disappear as soon as the cabin warmed. He planned to check his trapline, cut firewood to replace what he'd burned during the recent cold snap, and spend the evening working on a new pair of snowshoes to replace the ones that had finally given up after 7 years of hard use. He opened the cabin door to air that was so cold it made his lungs ache, and stepped onto the porch he'd built during his 4th year to keep snow from piling against the door during the worst storms. The world outside was pristine white, unmarked by any tracks except those of the rabbits and deer who'd ventured out during the night to forage for food. Samuel breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the clean, sharp air that never failed to remind him why he'd chosen this life over the complications and disappointments of civilization. The nearest neighbor lived 18 miles away, and Samuel had spoken to another human being exactly 4 times in the past year. Twice during his supply runs to Bear Creek, once when a lost hunter had stumbled onto his property in September, and once when he'd encountered a trapper heading north toward Wyoming. These brief interactions had confirmed his belief that most people had nothing interesting to say and little understanding of what truly mattered in life. Samuel had convinced himself that this isolation was not just preferable but necessary for his continued sanity and spiritual survival. He'd created a world where loss was impossible because attachment was forbidden, where disappointment couldn't reach him because expectations had been abandoned, and where the only promises that mattered were the ones he made to himself about staying alive another day in country that didn't care whether he lived or died. He had no way of knowing. As he stood on his porch watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, that his carefully constructed isolation was about to be shattered by 3 strangers who would arrive at his door with blood on their clothes and desperation in their eyes. He couldn't have imagined that before the sun set again. He would make a promise that would force him to remember what it felt like to care about someone else's survival more than his own. The last thing Samuel Creek expected, as he prepared for another routine day in his self-imposed exile, was that love would find him in the form of 2 terrified children and a dying woman's final plea. But the mountains had taught him many things over the years, and perhaps the most important lesson was that life rarely consulted a man's preferences before delivering the experiences that would define his character and determine his destiny. As he reached for his rifle and stepped into the snow to begin his daily routine, Samuel had no idea that his life as a hermit was about to end, and his transformation into something he'd never expected to become again, a father, was only hours away. Samuel had been checking his first trapline for barely an hour when he heard the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the desperate whinnying of a horse in distress, followed by a woman's voice calling out in pain and terror. The sounds came from the direction of his cabin, cutting through the morning stillness with an urgency that made his blood run cold. He abandoned his trap inspection and ran through the snow, his boots breaking through the crust with each hurried step. As he crested the small rise that gave him a clear view of his property, Samuel saw a scene that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his isolated world. A horse lay dying in the snow 20 yards from his porch, its flanks steaming in the cold air and dark blood spreading beneath its body. Beside the fallen animal, a woman knelt in the snow, clutching 2 small children against her chest while looking frantically toward his cabin. Even from a distance, Samuel could see that the woman was badly injured. Her dress was torn and stained with blood, and she moved with the desperate, unsteady motions of someone fighting against pain and exhaustion. The children, a girl who appeared to be around 8 years old, and a boy perhaps half that age, clung to their mother with the silent terror of those who had witnessed things no child should ever see. Samuel's first instinct was to retreat, to disappear back into the tree line, and wait for these strangers to move on or die, whichever came first. He had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of complication, and every rational part of his mind urged him to protect the sanctuary he had built through years of careful isolation. But as he watched the woman struggle to her feet, one arm wrapped around her ribs and the other reaching out toward his cabin, Something deeper than self-preservation stirred in his chest. He approached cautiously, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. The woman saw him coming and tried to stand straighter, though the effort clearly cost her. Up close, Samuel could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 25, with auburn hair that had escaped from a travel bun, and green eyes that held a mixture of hope and desperation that reminded him painfully of Sarah during her final illness. "Please," the woman gasped, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "My children need help. We've been riding for 3 days, and those men are still following us." Samuel stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the extent of her injuries, but far enough to retreat if this proved to be some kind of trap. The woman had been shot. That much was obvious from the way she favored her left side and the dark stain that had soaked through her wool coat. The children pressed against her legs, the boy sucking his thumb, while the girl watched Samuel with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Who shot you?" Samuel asked, his voice rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken to anyone in over 3 months, and the words felt foreign in his mouth. "Men from town," the woman replied, wincing as another wave of pain washed over her. "They want to take my children. Said their father had debts that needed paying, but that's not true. John never owed money to anyone, especially not to men like that." She reached into her coat pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it towards Samuel with a hand that shook from more than just the cold. "This letter explains everything. The children's names are Emma and Tommy. Emma is 8, Tommy just turned 5 last month." Samuel took the letter but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he studied the woman's face, looking for signs of deception or madness that might explain this surreal interruption of his carefully ordered life. What he saw instead was a mother's fierce love and the kind of desperate courage that only emerged when someone was fighting to protect what mattered most to them. "How did you find me?" he asked. "We didn't mean to," she admitted. "We were trying to reach the missionary station at Pine Ridge, but we got lost in yesterday's storm. The horse has been favoring his left front leg since this morning, and when we saw the smoke from your chimney," she swayed slightly, and Samuel realized that she was running on nothing but determination and maternal instinct. The boy, Tommy, began to cry, a soft, heartbroken sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. His sister immediately knelt beside him, whispering comforting words that were probably meaningless but delivered with the kind of fierce protectiveness that Samuel recognized from his own childhood, memories of being shielded by older siblings during their father's drinking. "Spells, Mama's bleeding," Tommy whispered, and Emma's face crumpled as she tried to comfort her brother while fighting back her own tears. The woman, their mother, looked down at her children with an expression that Samuel had seen once before, in Sarah's eyes during her final days when she'd known she was dying but had tried to be brave for his sake. It was the look of someone who understood that time was running out and that the most important conversations of a lifetime needed to happen quickly. "I need to get them inside," Samuel said, surprising himself with the decision. "You're losing too much blood to travel any further." Relief flooded the woman's face as she nodded gratefully. Samuel scooped Tommy into his arms, noting how the boy felt light and fragile, like a bird that might break if handled roughly. Emma walked beside him, one small hand clutched in her mother's, as they made their way slowly toward the cabin. Inside, Samuel settled the woman on his bed, while the children huddled together on the rough wooden floor, their eyes taking in every detail of the sparse interior. He built up the fire and put water on to boil, moving through the motions of preparing to treat a gunshot wound, while his mind struggled to process the sudden transformation of his sanctuary into something resembling a field hospital. The woman's name, she told him, was Catherine Morrison. Her husband, John, had been killed 6 months earlier in what the sheriff had claimed was a hunting accident, but Catherine had discovered evidence that suggested murder. The men pursuing them were connected to a land development scheme that required John's property, and they had decided that eliminating the entire family was simpler than dealing with legal complications. "I've been running for 2 weeks," Catherine whispered, as Samuel examined her wound. "Staying with friends, sleeping in barns, trying to reach somewhere safe. But they keep finding us, and I know they won't give up." Samuel cleaned the bullet wound as gently as possible, noting that the projectile had passed through her side without hitting any vital organs. She would survive the injury if infection didn't set in, but she had lost a dangerous amount of blood and needed rest that she clearly wasn't going to get if her pursuers were still tracking them. "How many men?" he asked. "3, maybe 4. The leader is a man named Garrett Welsh. He used to work for the railroad before he decided that intimidating widows and stealing land was more profitable. As Samuel worked, he became aware of the children watching his every movement. Emma had positioned herself between him and her brother, ready to protect Tommy, even though she was obviously terrified herself. The boy had stopped crying, but continued to suck his thumb, his wide eyes following his mother's every breath, as if he understood on some instinctual level that something terrible was happening. Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly as the afternoon wore on. The blood loss and exhaustion had weakened her beyond her body's ability to recover, and Samuel found himself fighting a familiar sense of helplessness as he watched another person he couldn't save slip away despite his best efforts. She developed a fever as evening approached, and her breathing became labored and irregular. "Listen to me," she whispered to Samuel during a moment of clarity just after sunset. "I'm not going to make it through the night, and we both know it. Those men will be here tomorrow, maybe sooner, and when they come, they'll take my babies." She reached under her coat and pressed something small and cold into Samuel's palm, a silver locket that was warm from her body heat and slick with her blood. "This has their father's picture inside. It's all they have left of him, and all they'll have left of me." Samuel opened the locket to reveal a faded photograph of a young man in a Sunday suit, his face kind but serious, his eyes holding the same gentle strength that Samuel could see in Emma's determined expression. On the opposite side was a tiny portrait of Catherine herself, taken perhaps on her wedding day, her face radiant with the kind of happiness that Samuel remembered from his own brief experience with love. "Promise me," Catherine said, her grip on his wrist surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. "Promise me you'll protect them. Not just from those men, but from the world. Help them grow up to be good people who remember that they were loved." Samuel stared down at the locket, feeling the weight of the request and the magnitude of what she was asking him to become. He had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, convinced that caring for others led only to loss and heartbreak. But as he looked at Emma and Tommy, huddled together on the floor and watching their mother die, he realized that some choices transcended personal preference and forced a man to become more than he thought himself capable of being. "I promise," he said quietly, and meant it with a conviction that surprised him. Catherine smiled, the first genuine expression of peace he had seen on her face, and closed her eyes. She died just before midnight, her hand still clutching the letter that contained everything she thought Samuel would need to know about raising her children. Samuel sat beside the bed for a long time after her breathing stopped, holding the blood-stained locket and listening to the soft sounds of the children's sleep. Emma had wrapped her arms around Tommy protectively, even in unconsciousness, and Samuel realized that his promise had transformed them all. He was no longer a hermit living in self-imposed isolation. He was a father, responsible for 2 lives that had been entrusted to his care by a dying woman's final act of faith in human decency. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of another storm and the certainty that the men Catherine had feared were still coming. Samuel tucked the locket into his shirt pocket and began to plan for a kind of battle he had never expected to fight. Not just for his own survival, but for the right to protect the family that had found him when he thought he had successfully hidden from the world. Dawn broke cold and grey over the mountain cabin, and with it came the terrible weight of Samuel's new reality. Catherine Morrison lay still beneath the old quilt he had covered her with during the night, while 8-year-old Emma sat beside the bed holding her mother's lifeless hand, and 5-year-old Tommy curled in his sister's lap, not yet fully understanding that the woman who had carried them through blizzards and gunfire would never wake up again. Samuel stood at the window, watching the tree line for any sign of the men Catherine had warned him about, but his attention kept drifting back to the children who had become his responsibility through no choice of his own. He had made coffee out of habit, but the cup sat untouched and cooling on the table as he struggled with the practical realities of sudden parenthood in a wilderness cabin designed for one solitary man. Emma hadn't spoken since her mother's death, but her eyes followed Samuel's every movement with the wary intelligence of a child who had learned not to trust adult promises. She wore a blue wool dress that had once been well made, but now showed the wear of their desperate flight, torn at the hem, stained with mud and her mother's blood, too thin for the mountain cold. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and her small hands were red and chapped from exposure to the weather. Tommy presented even more immediate challenges. The boy had wet himself during the night and was crying softly from hunger and confusion, reaching periodically toward his mother's still form as if he could wake her through sheer force of need. His clothes were in worse condition than his sister's, a cotton shirt that provided no warmth, trousers that had been mended multiple times, and shoes that were more whole than leather. Samuel's first attempt at communication was a disaster. He approached the children with what he hoped was a reassuring expression and asked if they were hungry, but his voice came out gruff and unfamiliar from disuse. Emma immediately pulled Tommy closer to her chest and shook her head, though Samuel could see from the way her stomach contracted that neither child had eaten a proper meal in days. He tried a different approach, moving slowly to the cast-iron stove and beginning to prepare breakfast without asking permission or expecting cooperation. He mixed cornmeal with water and a precious egg from his small supply, creating a simple porridge that he sweetened with honey from a jar he had been saving for special occasions. The familiar actions of cooking gave him something to do with his hands, while he wrestled with the overwhelming question of how a man learned to care for children when he had successfully avoided caring for anyone, including himself, for 15 years. The smell of food eventually drew the children's attention, though Emma remained suspicious and Tommy continued to whimper for his mother. Samuel filled 2 bowls with the warm porridge and set them on the floor beside the children, then retreated to the far side of the cabin to give them space to eat without feeling pressured or observed. Emma stared at the food for several minutes before her hunger overcame her caution. She helped Tommy hold his spoon and encouraged him to eat, speaking to her brother in whispers too soft for Samuel to overhear. The boy ate messily, getting more porridge on his clothes than in his mouth, but it was the first normal behavior Samuel had seen from either child since their arrival. While the children ate, Samuel forced himself to confront the practical decisions that could no longer be delayed. Catherine's body needed to be buried, but the ground was frozen solid, and he had no tools suitable for digging a grave in winter conditions. The children needed clean clothes, proper shoes, and sleeping arrangements that didn't involve huddling on the cabin floor. Most urgently, he needed to prepare for the arrival of the men who were hunting them, men who would kill 2 innocent children to protect their criminal enterprise. The solution to the burial problem came to him as he watched Emma carefully clean porridge from Tommy's face with the hem of her dress. He had a small storage shed built against the north wall of the cabin, currently filled with firewood and supplies. He could wrap Catherine's body and place it there until spring made burial possible. It wasn't ideal, but it would preserve her dignity while protecting the children from the sight of their mother's corpse decomposing. In the cabin's warmth, Samuel found clean shirts among his limited wardrobe, garments that would be comically large on the children but would provide warmth until he could fashion something more appropriate. He also located a pair of thick wool socks and some leather strips that could be used to secure Emma's 2 large shoes to her feet. When he approached the children with the clothes, Emma's first instinct was to refuse his help. She shook her head and pulled Tommy behind her, clearly determined to maintain what little independence remained to them. But when Samuel simply placed the items on the floor and returned to the far side of the cabin without speaking, she eventually crept forward to examine his offerings. The transformation was remarkable. Within an hour, both children were wearing Samuel's shirts, like oversized dresses, with sleeves rolled up and hems tucked to prevent tripping. Emma had helped Tommy into the wool socks, and though they came up to his knees, his feet were finally warm. She had even attempted to braid her own hair, though the result was uneven and would need attention from someone with more experience in such matters. Samuel's ragdoll emerged during this process of settling in. He had carved it years ago during a particularly long winter, originally intending it as a gift for Sarah's unborn child. After her death, he had kept it in a wooden box under his bed, unable to throw it away, but unwilling to be constantly reminded of what might have been. When he saw Emma eyeing the box curiously, he retrieved the doll and offered it to her without explanation. Emma's reaction surprised him. Instead of claiming the toy for herself, she immediately handed it to Tommy, who clutched it against his chest with the desperation of a drowning man grasping a rope. For the first time since his mother's death, the boy's crying stopped, replaced by the soft murmurs of a child talking to his new companion. "What's his name?" Samuel asked, gesturing toward the doll. Tommy looked up with eyes that were red from crying, but no longer filled with the wild terror of the previous day. "Mama," he whispered. And Samuel realized that the boy had transformed the carved figure into a substitute for the mother he had lost. Emma watched this exchange with the grave expression of someone much older than her 8 years. "He doesn't understand," she told Samuel, speaking directly to him for the first time. "He thinks Mama is sleeping and will wake up when she gets better." Samuel knelt beside the girl, bringing himself to her eye level and speaking in the gentlest tone he could manage. "What do you understand, Emma?" "I know she's dead," Emma replied with devastating matter-of-factness. "I know those bad men killed our papa and were trying to kill us too. And I know you promised to take care of us, but I don't know if you mean it." The honesty in her voice cut through Samuel's emotional defenses like a blade. Here was a child who had been forced to become an adult far too early, who had learned that the world was dangerous and that adults often failed to keep their promises. Her trust would have to be earned through actions rather than words. And Samuel realized that his own transformation from hermit to father would be measured by his ability to prove himself worthy of the faith that Catherine Morrison had placed in him. "I mean it," he told her. "But I don't know how to be a father, Emma. I've been living alone for a long time, and I'll need your help to learn what you and Tommy need." Something in Emma's expression softened slightly at this admission. Perhaps she had expected him to claim expertise he didn't possess, or perhaps she appreciated being treated as a partner rather than simply another responsibility. "Tommy needs to sleep with someone," she said. "He has bad dreams when he's alone, and he doesn't like loud noises since the men came to our house." Samuel nodded, filing away this information along with the dozen other details he was learning about childcare through trial and error. He had always been a practical man, skilled at solving problems through observation and adaptation. But children presented challenges that couldn't be addressed with the same straightforward methods he used to repair equipment or predict weather. Patterns. The rest of the morning was spent in quiet domesticity that felt both foreign and strangely comforting. Samuel moved Catherine's body to the storage shed, wrapping her in his best blanket and saying a few awkward words over her still form. When he returned to the cabin, he found Emma attempting to tidy the chaos of their arrival while Tommy sat in a corner, feeding imaginary food to his new doll and chattering to it in the nonsensical language that children used when they believed no adults were listening. By afternoon, they had established the beginnings of a routine. Emma helped with simple tasks like folding blankets and organizing the food supplies, her movements careful and precise in the way of children who had learned that mistakes sometimes carried serious consequences. Tommy remained largely in his own world, but he stayed close to his sister and no longer flinched when Samuel moved around the cabin. The first real test of their fragile new arrangement came at dinner time. Samuel had prepared another simple meal, beans and cornbread with dried meat. But when he placed the food in front of Tommy, the boy began crying and pushing the plate away. "He wants Mama to feed him," Emma explained, her own eyes filling with tears as she watched her brother's distress. She always cut his meat and told him stories while he ate. Samuel felt a familiar surge of helplessness, the same sensation that had overwhelmed him during Sarah's illness when he had wanted desperately to fix things that were beyond his ability to repair. But this time, instead of retreating into himself, he found himself reaching for solutions. He cut Tommy's meat into tiny pieces, then sat beside the boy and began to speak, not telling a story exactly, but describing the view from the cabin windows, the names of the mountains visible in the distance, and the animals that lived in the surrounding forest. His voice was rusty and uncertain, nothing like the warm, practiced tones that Catherine had probably used. But Tommy gradually stopped crying and began to eat. Emma watched this interaction with obvious surprise, as if she hadn't expected this gruff mountain man to show such patience with a grieving 5-year-old. When Tommy finished eating and climbed into Samuel's lap, still clutching his doll, something shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. It wasn't love yet. That would take time to develop, but it was the beginning of trust, the foundation upon which their unlikely family would eventually be built. As night fell and Samuel prepared sleeping arrangements for the children, he realized that his promise to Catherine had already begun to change him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The man who had spent 15 years avoiding all human connection was now tucking 2 orphan children into makeshift beds and checking the locks on his doors, not to keep the world out, but to keep his new family safe from the dangers that were still coming for them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the constant threat of the men who had killed Catherine's husband and would not hesitate to kill her children. But tonight, in the warm glow of the firelight, Samuel Creek began to remember what it felt like to have people depending on him for more than just survival. They needed him to help them heal, to grow, and to believe that the world still contained enough goodness to make living worthwhile. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine Morrison's death, and the mountain cabin had begun to feel less like a hermit's refuge and more like a home where 3 people were learning to live together despite having no roadmap for how such an arrangement should work. Samuel had fallen into routines he never could have imagined during his years of solitude, waking before dawn, not just to tend the fire and prepare for his own day, but to check on 2 sleeping children and ensure that Tommy hadn't kicked off his blankets during the night. The boy had proved to be a restless sleeper, plagued by nightmares that left him crying and reaching for his mother. Samuel had initially tried to comfort him from across the cabin, offering awkward words of reassurance from a distance. But Emma had finally taken matters into her own hands and moved Tommy's makeshift bed closer to Samuel's own. Now the boy slept curled against Samuel's side most nights, his small hand clutching the carved doll that had become his constant companion. Emma remained more reserved, watching Samuel with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly. But she had begun to help with daily tasks without being asked, and Samuel had caught her humming softly to herself while she folded clothes or helped prepare meals. She was a remarkably capable child, able to mend torn fabric with neat stitches and possess an intuitive understanding of how to manage her younger brother's moods and fears. The morning routine had evolved into something that felt almost natural. Samuel would wake first and build up the fire, moving quietly to avoid disturbing the children. Emma would emerge from her nest of blankets shortly after, her hair tangled from sleep, but her expression alert and ready for whatever the day might bring. Tommy was always the last to wake, requiring gentle coaxing and the promise of warm breakfast before he would abandon the security of his blankets. This particular morning brought something new. Tommy's first attempt at helping with the daily chores. He had been watching Samuel tend the fire for weeks, fascinated by the process of arranging kindling and stoking the flames. When Samuel handed him a small piece of wood and showed him how to place it carefully on the burning logs, the boy's face lit up with pride at being trusted with such an important task. "I'm helping," Tommy announced to his doll, holding the carved figure up so it could observe his contribution to the morning routine. "See, Mama? I'm helping Samuel make the fire warm." Emma smiled at her brother's enthusiasm, and Samuel found himself unexpectedly moved by the simple pleasure the boy took in being useful. It occurred to him that this was perhaps what Catherine had meant when she asked him to help the children grow up to be good people, not just keeping them alive, but teaching them to find purpose and satisfaction in contributing to something larger than themselves. Breakfast had become their first real family meal of each day. Samuel had learned to make his coffee less strong after discovering that both children enjoyed small cups of the diluted brew with generous amounts of honey. Emma had taught him to cook eggs the way she and Tommy preferred them, scrambled until they were almost solid, with tiny pieces of dried meat mixed in for flavor. Tommy had appointed himself the official taste tester for everything that came out of the cast-iron skillet, a role he took seriously, despite his tendency to pronounce everything good, regardless of how it actually tasted. The conversation during these meals had gradually become more natural and wide-ranging. Emma had begun asking questions about the mountains, the animals they could see from the cabin windows, and Samuel's life before they arrived. He answered her inquiries as honestly as he could, though he found himself editing out the darker aspects of his past and focusing instead on practical information about wilderness survival and the seasonal changes that governed life in the high country. Tommy's contributions to these discussions were less verbal, but equally important. He had developed an elaborate fantasy world involving his doll, which he now called Little Mama, and he would narrate complex adventures and conversations between himself and his carved companion. Samuel had initially found these one-sided exchanges unsettling, but Emma had explained that talking to the doll helped Tommy process his grief and confusion about their changed circumstances. "He's teaching Little Mama about our new house," Emma told Samuel one morning as they watched Tommy show the doll around the cabin, pointing out important features like the woodpile and the window that faced the sunrise. "He says Little Mama was scared when we first came here, but now she likes it because Samuel takes good care of us." Samuel felt something tight and painful in his chest at these words, not the sharp agony of loss that he remembered from Sarah's death, but something warmer and more complex. The realization that these children were beginning to feel safe with him, that Tommy's elaborate fantasy life now included him as a protector rather than a threat, represented a kind of victory he hadn't known he was fighting for. The practical aspects of caring for the children had proved easier to manage than Samuel had expected. Emma was old enough to help with cooking and cleaning, and she had a natural talent for organizing their limited space efficiently. Tommy required more direct supervision, but his enthusiasm for helping made even simple tasks feel like adventures. Samuel had taught them both basic safety rules for living in the wilderness. Never go outside alone. Always tell him where they were going within the cabin, and never touch his weapons without permission. But it was the emotional aspects of sudden parenthood that continued to challenge Samuel in unexpected ways. Both children still grieved for their parents, and their sadness would surface without warning during otherwise peaceful moments. Emma might suddenly start crying while folding laundry because the texture of a particular fabric reminded her of her mother's dress. Tommy would wake from naps calling for his father, confused and frightened when he remembered that Papa wasn't coming home from his hunting trip. Samuel's initial response to these episodes had been awkward and ineffective. He would offer practical solutions, more food, warmer clothes, activities to distract them from their sadness, without understanding that what the children needed most was simply to have their grief acknowledged and accepted. It was Emma who taught him the difference between fixing and comforting, explaining that sometimes Tommy just needed to cry and be held until the sadness passed. Mama used to say that crying helps wash the hurt out of your heart, Emma told him after one of Tommy's difficult afternoons. She said it was okay to be sad about Papa being gone, as long as we remembered all the good times too. This wisdom from an 8-year-old girl humbled Samuel in ways he hadn't expected. He began to sit with the children during their moments of grief instead of trying to distract them from it. He learned to hold Tommy when nightmares made him inconsolable, and to listen when Emma wanted to share memories of her parents without feeling obligated to offer solutions or explanations. The first drawing appeared on a cold afternoon in March, when melting snow had created muddy conditions that kept them confined to the cabin. Tommy had been restless and irritable, missing the outdoor play that had helped burn off his abundant energy. Emma had suggested that he draw pictures to entertain himself, using charcoal from the fireplace and precious paper from Samuel's journal. Tommy's artistic skills were limited, but his subject matter was unmistakable. He drew 3 stick figures standing in front of a square shape with a triangle on top, clearly the cabin, with a larger figure in the middle and 2 smaller ones on either side. Above the scene, he had attempted to draw what might have been the sun, though it looked more like a lopsided circle, with lines radiating from it in all directions. "This is our family," Tommy announced, holding up the drawing for Samuel and Emma to admire. "That's Samuel, and that's me, and that's Emma. We all live in the warm house together." Samuel stared at the simple drawing, feeling something profound shift in his understanding of what was happening to them all. Somewhere during the past 3 weeks, without conscious decision or formal declaration, they had indeed become a family. Not the conventional family that Emma and Tommy had lost, and not the family that Samuel had dreamed of with Sarah, but something new and unexpected that had emerged from tragedy and mutual need. Emma seemed to understand the significance of the moment as well. She carefully took the drawing from her brother and smoothed it flat against the table, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for important documents. "Can we keep this?" she asked Samuel. "Can we put it somewhere special so we can always remember when Tommy drew our family?" Samuel found a place of honor for the drawing on the wall beside his bed, using small nails to secure it, where he would see it every morning when he woke and every evening before he slept. The simple act of displaying Tommy's artwork transformed the cabin in a way that no amount of practical improvements could have accomplished. It was no longer just a shelter where 3 people happened to be staying together. It was a home where a family lived and created memories worth preserving. The drawing also marked a turning point in Samuel's relationship with both children. Tommy began approaching him more freely, climbing onto his lap during evening stories and seeking him out when Emma was busy with other activities. Emma's wariness gradually gave way to something that resembled affection, though she maintained the careful reserve of someone who had learned that adults sometimes left without warning. Samuel found himself changing in response to their trust. He began to consider their preferences when planning meals, to tell stories that would interest them during the long evening hours, and to think about their futures in ways that extended beyond simple survival. He caught himself humming while he worked, something he hadn't done since Sarah's death, and realized that the sound of children's voices had transformed his cabin from a tomb of memories into a place where new life was taking root. The physical evidence of their developing family bond accumulated gradually. Emma's careful mending had extended the life of their limited clothing, while Samuel had begun carving small toys and practical items sized for children's hands. Tommy's collection of drawings grew to include pictures of animals he had seen from the cabin windows, imaginary friends who lived in the forest, and variations on his family portrait that showed their daily activities with increasing detail and confidence. But perhaps the most significant change was in the quality of their conversations. During the quiet hours between supper and bedtime, Samuel had begun sharing carefully edited stories from his own childhood, tales of learning to hunt and fish with his father, of winters when snow had blocked their farmhouse for weeks at a time, of the satisfaction that came from building something useful with your own hands. Emma and Tommy reciprocated with their own memories, gradually painting a picture of their life before tragedy struck. Their father had been a patient man who taught Emma to read, using the Bible and old newspapers, who had shown Tommy how to whittle simple shapes from soft wood. Their mother had sung lullabies in the evening and told stories about magical places where children could fly and animals could talk. These exchanges of memory and experience wove the three of them together in ways that Samuel was only beginning to understand. They were creating a shared history, building the foundation of trust and affection that would allow them to face whatever challenges lay ahead, including the arrival of the men who were still hunting for Catherine Morrison's children. Samuel hadn't forgotten about Garrett Welsh and his associates, but their failure to appear during the past 3 weeks had lulled him into a cautious optimism that perhaps the children's trail had grown too cold to follow. He maintained his vigilance, checking the perimeter of his property daily and keeping his weapons cleaned and ready. But the immediate terror of those first days had given way to a more manageable state of alert preparation. As he watched Emma help Tommy wash his face before bed and listened to the boy's detailed explanation of the day's adventures to his beloved doll, Samuel realized that Catherine Morrison's dying wish was already coming true. Her children were indeed growing up to be good people who remembered that they were loved, not just by the parents they had lost, but by the unlikely father figure who had promised to protect them and was discovering that protection involved far more than he had ever imagined. The discovery that would change everything came on a warm April morning when Emma was helping Samuel sort through the children's few belongings to see what clothing might be salvaged for the coming summer months. Most of their possessions had been damaged during their desperate flight through the mountains, but Emma had carefully preserved a small cloth bundle that contained the most precious remnants of their former life. Samuel had been respectful of the children's privacy regarding these personal items, understanding that some grief required solitude and that Emma especially needed to maintain some connection to her parents' memory. But when she asked for his help, mending a torn piece of fabric that had once been part of her mother's dress, their joint examination of the bundle revealed something that neither of them had expected to find. Wrapped in the folds of Catherine's damaged dress was a silver pocket watch, its surface tarnished but its mechanism still functional. Emma held it reverently, explaining that it had belonged to her father and that her mother had saved it from their burning house during their escape. The watch itself was beautiful, clearly crafted by a skilled artisan. But what made Samuel's blood run cold were the initials engraved on its back. J.M., from the Colorado Territory Railroad Commission, 1871. Samuel stared at the inscription for a long moment, his mind racing through implications that he didn't want to acknowledge. John Morrison hadn't been just another homesteader killed for his land. He had been a railroad commissioner, someone with access to information about land surveys, mineral rights, and the kind of development plans that could make certain men very wealthy if they could eliminate the officials who stood in their way. But it was the second line of engraving that made Samuel's hands tremble as he held the watch. In recognition of service to Colonel Samuel Creek. Rhett, the name hit him like a physical blow. Colonel Samuel Creek, his real name, his military rank, and a connection to his past that he had spent 15 years trying to bury in the Colorado wilderness. Emma was watching his face with growing concern, clearly confused by his sudden pallor and the way his hands had begun to shake. "Did you know my papa?" she asked quietly, her young voice cutting through the storm of memories that the watch had unleashed. Samuel sat down heavily in his chair, still holding the timepiece and struggling to process the magnitude of what this discovery meant. John Morrison hadn't just been a random victim of land grabbers. He had been connected to Samuel's military service, possibly even someone who had worked directly under his command during the chaotic years following the Civil War, when the army had been tasked with protecting railroad construction crews from Indian attacks and civilian sabotage. I think I might have, Samuel admitted, his voice hoarse with the weight of revelation. Your father worked for the railroad, but he also worked with the army. I was a colonel then, in charge of protecting railroad surveyors and construction crews. If your father had this watch, it means he did something important enough to earn recognition from my unit. Emma moved closer, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Were you friends? Did you like him? Samuel closed his eyes, trying to summon memories from a period of his life that he had deliberately suppressed. Images began to surface. A young, serious man with kind eyes and an unshakable moral compass. Someone who had questioned orders when they conflicted with his sense of justice. Who had saved Samuel's life during an ambush near the Colorado River. John Morrison, Samuel whispered. The name finally connecting with a face and a set of memories that had been buried under years of grief and isolation. He was my surveyor liaison, and he was one of the best men I ever served with. He saved my life once, and he never compromised his principles, even when it would have been easier to look the other way. The implications of this connection were staggering. Garrett Welsh and his associates weren't just after the Morrison children because of their father's land. They were eliminating potential witnesses to something much larger, possibly involving corruption in the railroad development programs that had shaped the Colorado Territory during the 1870s. John Morrison had been killed not just as a homesteader, but as someone who had possessed information that could expose criminal activities worth millions of dollars. Samuel looked at Emma, seeing her father's moral courage reflected in her 8-year-old face, and realized that his promise to Catherine had become something far more complex than simple protection. These children weren't just orphans in need of a guardian. They were the key to unraveling a conspiracy that had already cost their parents lives, and would certainly cost more lives if the men responsible weren't stopped. Tommy, who had been playing quietly in the corner with his doll, seemed to sense the tension in the room. He approached Samuel cautiously, his small face creased with worry. "Are you sad about something?" he asked, climbing onto Samuel's lap with the unconscious trust that had developed over their weeks together. Samuel wrapped his arms around the boy, drawing comfort from Tommy's warm presence, while his mind grappled with the implications of their situation. "I'm not sad, Tommy. I'm just remembering things about your papa that I had forgotten." "Good things?" Tommy asked hopefully. "Yes," Samuel replied, and meant it. "Very good things. Your father was a brave man who always tried to do what was right, even when it was dangerous." Emma had been listening to this exchange with the serious attention that characterized her approach to adult conversations. "Is that why the bad men killed him? Because he was trying to do what was right?" Samuel nodded, unable to soften the truth for a child who had already learned that the world could be cruel and unfair. "I think so, Emma, and I think that's why they're still looking for you and Tommy, because they're afraid that your father might have told your mother something important before he died. The watch had become more than just a memento of their father's life. It was evidence of a connection that could explain everything about their family's persecution and Samuel's unwitting involvement in their story. But it also represented a new level of danger, because if Garrett Welsh discovered that the children were now under the protection of Colonel Samuel Creek, the stakes of their conflict would escalate beyond anything Samuel had prepared for. Samuel's military service had ended under circumstances that he preferred not to remember, but his reputation as a tactical commander and his knowledge of irregular warfare had made him enemies among certain civilian contractors who had profited from the chaos and corruption of post-war development projects. If Welsh was connected to those same networks, then Samuel's involvement in protecting the Morrison children would transform their situation from a simple case of child endangerment into something approaching a military campaign. Over the following days, Samuel found himself studying Emma and Tommy with new eyes, looking for traces of John Morrison's character and trying to understand what kind of man would have earned such respect from his superior officers. The evidence was there in Emma's careful attention to moral questions, in her instinctive protection of her younger brother, and in Tommy's trusting nature and innate goodness. Samuel began sharing more specific memories of their father, carefully editing his stories to focus on John's courage and integrity, rather than the violence and moral ambiguity that had characterized much of their military service. He told Emma about the time her father had risked his own life to warn a group of homesteaders about an impending Indian attack, and how John had refused to accept bribes from contractors who wanted favorable survey reports regardless of the actual terrain conditions. These stories seemed to provide Emma with a deeper understanding of her father's character and the reasons behind his death. She began asking more sophisticated questions about right and wrong, about the responsibilities that came with knowledge and power, and about the costs of standing up for justice in a world where corrupt men held significant influence. Tommy's response to learning about their father's heroism was typically childlike, but no less meaningful. He incorporated Papa the Brave Man into his elaborate fantasy games with his doll, creating adventures where their father protected people from bad men and always made sure that children were safe and fed. But the watch had also forced Samuel to confront aspects of his own past that he had successfully avoided for 15 years. His military service had ended not in glory, but in disillusionment, when he had realized that some of the men he was protecting were more interested in personal profit than in building the kind of civilization that would benefit ordinary families like the Morrisons. Samuel had resigned his commission after discovering evidence of systematic corruption in the railroad development programs, but his attempts to expose the criminal activities had been blocked by superior officers who were either incompetent or complicit. His final act as a soldier had been to testify before a military tribunal about irregularities in land surveys and construction contracts, testimony that had made him powerful enemies but had resulted in no meaningful prosecutions. The pocket watch represented not just John Morrison's service and sacrifice, but Samuel's own failed attempts to fight corruption from within the system. Now, 15 years later, he was being given a second chance to finish what he had started, not as a colonel bound by military regulations and political constraints, but as a man with the freedom to protect his family, using whatever means proved necessary. Samuel cleaned and oiled the pocket watch, restoring its silver surface to something approaching its original luster. When he wound the mechanism, it began keeping time with the same precision that had once helped John Morrison coordinate surveying expeditions across dangerous territory. The steady tick of the watch became a constant reminder of the debt Samuel owed to a good man who had died, trying to protect his family from the same forces that were now threatening his children. As April turned toward May and the mountain snow began its annual retreat, Samuel found himself planning not just for the arrival of Garrett Welsh and his men, but for a confrontation that would determine whether John Morrison's sacrifice had been meaningless or whether justice might still be possible for families like the one that Samuel had unexpectedly acquired. The watch, with its engraved recognition of service and sacrifice, had transformed Samuel's promise to a dying woman into something approaching a military mission. He was no longer just protecting two orphaned children. He was continuing a fight that had begun years earlier and could only end when the men responsible for destroying the Morrison family were held accountable for their crimes. Emma seemed to understand the significance of what the watch represented, though she couldn't fully grasp the historical and political complexities involved. She had taken to checking its time each morning, treating the ritual as a way of honoring her father's memory, while also marking their progress toward whatever resolution lay ahead. Papa always said that time was the most valuable thing we could give to people we cared about, she told Samuel one evening as they sat by the fire, the watch open in her small hands. He said that when you spend time with someone, you're giving them a piece of your life that you can never get back. Samuel thought about this wisdom as he watched Emma and Tommy settle into their evening routines, understanding for the first time that his isolation had been not just a retreat from pain, but a hoarding of time that could have been spent building something meaningful with people who deserved his care and attention. The watch had brought back memories of John Morrison's character, but it had also reminded Samuel of the man he had once been, someone willing to fight for justice even when the personal cost was high. Now, as he prepared for the inevitable arrival of the men who had killed John and Catherine Morrison, Samuel realized that the pocket watch had given him something even more valuable than evidence of the children's heritage. It had restored his sense of purpose and reminded him that some fights were worth finishing. Regardless of the personal consequences, the steady tick of John Morrison's watch marked time in a cabin that had been transformed from a hermit's refuge into a fortress where a makeshift family prepared to defend not just their lives, but their right to exist in a world where good men like John Morrison were supposed to be protected rather than murdered for their integrity. The necessity of a supply run to Bear Creek had been weighing on Samuel's mind for weeks. Their stores of flour, coffee, and ammunition were running dangerously low, and both children needed proper clothing for the approaching summer months. Emma had grown noticeably taller during their time together, and Tommy's shoes were so worn that his toes were nearly protruding through the leather. But more importantly, Samuel needed information about Garrett Welsh and his men, whether they were still searching for the children, what story they were telling the local authorities, and how much danger his makeshift family faced from the outside world. Samuel had avoided making this trip for as long as possible, reluctant to leave Emma and Tommy alone and unwilling to expose them to the risks of traveling to town. But their isolation, while providing security, was also leaving them blind to developments in the wider world that could affect their safety and future. The decision to make the journey came when Emma developed a persistent cough that Samuel's limited medical knowledge couldn't address adequately. She insisted that she felt fine, but Samuel had learned to read the subtle signs of illness in children, and he knew that mountain pneumonia could kill someone her size if it wasn't treated properly. They needed proper medicine, and that meant risking a trip to the settlement where a doctor could provide both diagnosis and treatment. Samuel spent 2 days preparing for the journey, teaching Emma and Tommy emergency procedures and hiding places that they could use if strangers approached the cabin while he was gone. He showed Emma how to use his spare rifle, though he prayed she would never need such knowledge, and made her promise to take Tommy and hide in the root cellar if anyone except Samuel himself came within sight of their home. "I'll be back before sunset," he promised as he saddled his horse in the grey light of early morning. "If I'm not back by tomorrow morning, you take Tommy and follow the creek downstream until you reach the missionary station at Pine Ridge. Tell them who you are and what happened to your parents. They'll help you." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding the seriousness of these instructions while trying not to show the fear that Samuel could see in her eyes. Tommy clung to his sister's hand, clutching his doll, and clearly anxious about Samuel's departure, but trusting in the routines and promises that had governed their life together. The ride to Bear Creek took Samuel through terrain that he hadn't seen in over a year, and he was struck by how much the landscape had changed during his absence. New trails had been cut through the forest, and he could see evidence of increased mining activity in the hills to the north. The territory was developing rapidly, bringing with it both opportunity and the kind of lawlessness that accompanied quick wealth and weak government oversight. Bear Creek itself had grown substantially since Samuel's last visit. The main street now boasted a proper hotel, a second saloon, and a general store that looked prosperous enough to stock the supplies that Samuel needed. But the town's growth also meant more strangers, more questions, and a higher likelihood that Garrett Welsh or his associates might have agents watching for signs of the Morrison children. Samuel's first stop was the doctor's office, where he described Emma's symptoms and purchased the medications that might prevent her cough from developing into something more serious. Dr. Matthews, was a competent man who asked few questions about Samuel's domestic arrangements, accepting his explanation that he was caring for orphaned relatives without demanding documentation or details. The general store provided the clothing and supplies that Samuel needed, though the shopkeeper's casual questions about his family made Samuel uncomfortable. He kept his answers vague and paid in cash, avoiding the kind of detailed conversation that might later be repeated to the wrong people. It was at the saloon, during his attempt to gather information through carefully casual conversation, that Samuel discovered the extent of the danger they were facing. The bartender, a talkative man who knew everyone's business and enjoyed sharing what he knew, mentioned that some men had been asking questions about a woman traveling with 2 children several months earlier. Railroad men, the bartender explained, wiping down glasses with a stained towel. Said they were looking for a widow who had stolen some company property after her husband died. Offered good money for information about her whereabouts. Samuel's blood chilled as he realized that Welsh and his associates were not only still searching for Emma and Tommy, but had created a cover story that would make local authorities more likely to cooperate with their efforts. By claiming that Catherine Morrison was a thief rather than a victim, they had transformed their manhunt into something that would attract community support rather than suspicion. "Did anyone see this woman?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice casual, despite the tension that was making his hands shake. "Not that anyone admitted," the bartender replied. "But word is, they're expanding their search, bringing in more men and offering bigger rewards. Someone really wants to find this family." Samuel finished his drink and excused himself, his mind racing with the implications of what he had learned. The men hunting for Emma and Tommy were not giving up. They were escalating their efforts and using tactics that would make it increasingly difficult for the children to remain hidden. More troubling still was the possibility that someone in Bear Creek might have seen Samuel with children and made the connection that Welsh's men were hoping to find. His fears were confirmed when he stopped at the post office to check whether any mail had been delivered to the general delivery address he had used. Years earlier, during his first trips to town, the postmaster, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a good memory, greeted Samuel with enthusiasm that immediately put him on guard. "Samuel Creek, haven't seen you in town for months. Heard you've been taking care of some children up at your place. That's real Christian of you, helping out family in need." Samuel's heart sank as he realized that his secret was already widely known in the small community. In a town the size of Bear Creek, any change in routine was noticed and discussed, and his recent purchases of children's clothing and medical supplies had obviously generated exactly the kind of attention he had hoped to avoid. "Just doing what needs to be done," Samuel replied carefully. But the postmaster's next words confirmed his worst fears. "Funny thing, though. Had some men asking about you just last week. Railroad investigators, they said. Wanted to know if you'd been seen with any children, particularly a girl and a younger boy. I told them I didn't know anything about your business, but they seemed real interested in your property and how long you'd been living up there." Samuel felt the world tilting around him as he understood that his location was no longer secret. Welsh's men knew where to find him, and they had been asking specific questions about Emma and Tommy. The only question now was how much time he had before they arrived at his cabin with whatever force they deemed necessary to take the children. He thanked the postmaster and left town immediately, pushing his horse harder than was wise on the mountain trails, but driven by the urgent need to return to Emma and Tommy before their enemies could reach them. As he rode, Samuel found himself studying the landscape with tactical eyes for the first time in 15 years. Identifying defensive positions, escape routes, and the natural features that could be used to advantage in the kind of asymmetric conflict that now seemed inevitable. The ride home felt endless, though Samuel knew he was making good time. Every shadow in the forest could conceal an ambush. Every sound could signal the approach of armed men, and every minute that passed brought him closer to a confrontation that he had hoped to avoid, but was now prepared to embrace. When he finally reached his cabin just before sunset, Samuel was relieved to see Emma and Tommy playing quietly on the porch, apparently safe and unaware of the storm that was gathering around their small family. But as he dismounted and gathered his supplies, Samuel noticed something that made his blood freeze: fresh horse tracks in the mud beside his corral. Tracks that were too large and too recent to have been made by his own mount. Emma ran to greet him with obvious relief, but her first words confirmed his worst fears. "Some men came by this afternoon," she said quietly, glancing toward Tommy to make sure he wasn't listening. "They asked if we had seen a woman and 2 children traveling through the area. I told them we hadn't seen anyone, and they rode away. But they kept looking at the cabin, like they were trying to remember something." Samuel knelt beside Emma, his hands on her shoulders and his voice urgent but controlled. "Did they say who they were? Did they mention your mother or father?" "They said they were railroad investigators," Emma replied, her young face serious with the understanding that something important and dangerous was happening. "They said they were looking for criminals who had stolen railroad property, but they kept staring at me and Tommy like they thought they recognized us." Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision that could no longer be avoided. Garrett Welsh's men had found them, and while they hadn't acted immediately, it was only a matter of time before they returned with sufficient force to take the children by violence if necessary. The days of hiding were over, and the time for fighting had arrived. That evening, as Samuel helped Emma and Tommy prepare for bed, he caught sight of something that made his heart sink: a wanted poster nailed to a tree at the edge of his property, visible from the cabin windows, and clearly placed there as a message. Even from a distance, Samuel could make out his own face on the poster, along with text that identified him as a fugitive from military justice and offered a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. The poster was more than just a threat. It was evidence that Welsh had connections to Samuel's military past and access to records that most civilian criminals wouldn't be able to obtain. The fight that was coming would not be between a mountain hermit and some local toughs, but between a former army colonel and men who understood exactly who they were dealing with and what kind of resistance they could expect. As Samuel checked his weapons and began planning for the defense of his makeshift family, he realized that the poster represented both a curse and a blessing. While it meant that his enemies knew his identity and capabilities, it also meant that the final confrontation would be fought on terms that Samuel understood better than most men. He had spent years learning how to protect people and territory against superior numbers and resources, and those skills were about to be tested in the most personal battle of his life. The wanted poster fluttered in the evening breeze, its presence transforming Samuel's mountain refuge into a fortress under siege. But as he watched Emma and Tommy sleeping peacefully in their beds, trusting in his ability to keep them safe, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced since his military service: the calm certainty that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done, and having the skills and determination to do it tomorrow would bring Garrett Welsh and his men, along with whatever violence they thought necessary to eliminate the witnesses to their crimes. But tonight, Samuel Creek began his transformation from reluctant guardian back into the tactical commander who had once been respected and feared throughout the Colorado Territory. The children sleeping in his cabin deserved the protection that only that man could provide, and Samuel was finally ready to become him again. The morning after Samuel's discovery of the wanted poster brought a conversation that he had been dreading but could no longer avoid. Emma had noticed his increased vigilance, the way he checked and rechecked his weapons, and the careful attention he paid to every sound from the surrounding forest. She was too intelligent to believe that these preparations were routine, and too mature to be satisfied with evasive answers about their safety. Samuel found her sitting at the kitchen table after breakfast, staring out the window with a serious expression that meant she was thinking about things beyond her years. Tommy was playing quietly in his corner, Absorbed in an elaborate game involving his doll and a collection of carved wooden animals that Samuel had made during the long winter evenings. "They're coming back, aren't they?" Emma asked without looking at Samuel. "Those men who were asking questions yesterday. They know who we are." Samuel sat down across from her, recognizing that the time for protective lies had passed. Emma deserved to understand what they were facing, and more importantly, she needed to be prepared for what might happen in the coming days. "Yes," he said simply. "They know where we are, and they know who I am. The situation has become more dangerous than I hoped it would." Emma turned to meet his eyes, and Samuel was struck again by the adult wisdom that tragedy had forced upon her young face. "Tell me about the poster," she said. "Tell me who you really are." Samuel had hoped to have more time before this revelation became necessary, but Emma's directness made it impossible to delay the conversation any longer. He rose from the table and retrieved a wooden box from beneath his bed, a container he hadn't opened in 15 years but had never been able to bring himself to destroy. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the Congressional Medal of Honor that had been awarded to Colonel Samuel Creek for valor during the Indian Wars of the early 1870s. Beside it lay his commission papers, signed by General Sherman himself, and a collection of commendations that testified to a military career distinguished by both tactical brilliance and uncompromising integrity. Emma examined these documents with the careful attention she gave to everything important, reading slowly through the formal language that described her guardian's service to his country. When she looked up, her expression held not fear, but a kind of proud recognition, as if she had always suspected that Samuel was more than just a simple mountain hermit. "You were a war hero," she said, her voice filled with wonder rather than accusation. "I was a soldier," Samuel corrected gently. "And like your father, I tried to do what was right, even when it made powerful people angry with me." The full story emerged slowly, as Samuel found himself explaining not just his military service, but the corruption and disillusionment that had driven him into exile. He told Emma about the railroad development contracts that had been awarded to companies more interested in profit than in serving the public good, about the systematic exploitation of homesteaders and Native Americans alike, and about the network of corrupt officials who had made enormous fortunes while honest. Men like John Morrison had died for opposing their criminal enterprises. "My last assignment was to investigate irregularities in the railroad surveys," Samuel explained, his hands still holding the medal that represented both his greatest achievement and his greatest failure. "I discovered that certain companies were falsifying survey reports to obtain mineral rights that should have belonged to homesteaders, and that some military officers were being paid to ignore these crimes." Emma listened with the intense concentration that she brought to all serious matters, asking occasional questions that revealed her understanding of the moral complexities involved. "Is that why you knew my papa? Because he was helping with your investigation?" "Your father was the one who brought the evidence to my attention," Samuel replied. "He had been documenting the fraud for months, gathering proof that could have sent a dozen men to prison and recovered millions of dollars in stolen land and mineral rights. But before we could present our findings to the proper authorities, someone leaked information about our investigation to the men we were investigating. The aftermath had been swift and brutal. John Morrison had been transferred to a remote surveying assignment where he would be isolated and vulnerable, while Samuel had been reassigned to duties that would prevent him from pursuing the corruption investigation. When Samuel had attempted to go over his superior officers' heads and present his evidence directly to Washington, he had been accused of insubordination and threatened with court-martial. "I resigned my commission rather than face a military trial that would have been rigged against me," Samuel continued, his voice heavy with old regrets. "I thought that by disappearing into the wilderness, I could protect myself and maybe even protect your father by removing the threat that my investigation represented. to the men we had been exposing. Emma's next question cut straight to the heart of Samuel's guilt, about the choices he had made 15 years earlier. But it didn't protect Papa, did it? They killed him anyway. Samuel felt the weight of failure that had haunted him since the day he had learned about John Morrison's death. No, it didn't protect him. Your father continued the investigation on his own, probably hoping that he could gather enough evidence to ensure that justice would eventually be served. But he was only one man, and the people he was fighting had resources and connections that made them almost impossible to defeat through legal means. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy's approach. His small face clouded with concern as he sensed the serious nature of the discussion taking place at the kitchen table. "Are you sad again?" he asked Emma, climbing onto her lap and offering her his doll for comfort. Emma wrapped her arms around her brother, holding him close while she processed everything that Samuel had told her. "I'm not sad, Tommy, I'm just learning. About Papa and about Samuel, and about why we have to be careful about the bad men." Tommy accepted this explanation with the trusting simplicity that characterized his approach to the adult world. But his presence reminded Samuel that their conversation had implications beyond historical understanding. These revelations about his past and the children's heritage were leading to decisions about their future that would affect all their lives. "What happens now?" Emma asked when Tommy had returned to his games. "Do we run away again or do we fight?" Samuel looked at this 8-year-old girl who was asking him to make decisions that should never have been necessary, and realized that she deserved a voice in determining her own fate. "What do you want to do, Emma? You and Tommy have already lost your parents to these men. You shouldn't have to lose your home too." Emma's response revealed the strength of character that had enabled her to survive everything that had happened to her family. "I want to stay," she said firmly. "I want to fight them, and I want to make them pay for what they did to Mama and Papa." Samuel felt a surge of pride at her courage, followed immediately by fear for what that courage might cost her. "Fighting means that people might get hurt, Emma. It means taking risks that could result in losing everything we've built together." "We've already lost everything once," Emma replied with devastating logic. "If we run away now, we'll just have to keep running forever. And Tommy will never be safe until those men are stopped." Samuel realized that Emma was right, and that her moral clarity was forcing him to confront truths about justice and responsibility that he had been avoiding since his military service ended. The corruption that had killed John and Catherine Morrison was still spreading, still destroying families, and still operating with impunity because good people like himself had chosen safety over confrontation. "If we're going to fight," Samuel said carefully, "then you need to understand what that means. These aren't ordinary criminals. They're part of a network that includes corrupt officials, hired killers, and businessmen who view murder as simply another tool for maximizing profits. Fighting them means accepting that we might not survive, but also that our fight might prevent them from destroying other families." Emma nodded solemnly, her young face reflecting an understanding of sacrifice that should have been years in her future. "Papa would want us to fight," she said with quiet conviction. "And Mama would want us to protect other children like Tommy." That afternoon, Samuel began teaching Emma the tactical knowledge that their situation would require. He showed her how to recognize the approach of armed men, how to signal warnings without alerting their enemies, and how to use the terrain around their cabin to maximum defensive advantage. Emma proved to be an attentive student, absorbing information with the same careful attention that she brought to all her learning. Tommy, who was too young for such serious instruction, was nevertheless included in the basic safety procedures that would govern their lives until the threat was resolved. He learned to recognize the signal that meant hide immediately, and he practiced moving quickly and quietly to the root cellar that would serve as their emergency shelter. As evening approached, Samuel found himself standing on his porch with the Medal of Honor in his hands, watching the sun set over the mountains that had been his refuge for 15 years. The medal felt heavier than he remembered, weighted not just with its own metal, but with the responsibility and sacrifice that it represented. Emma joined him on the porch, her small hand slipping into his as they watched the last light fade from the western peaks. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. Samuel considered the question seriously, recognizing that she deserved an honest answer rather than false reassurance. "I'm scared for you and Tommy," he admitted. "I'm scared that my past has brought danger to people I care about. But I'm not scared of the fighting itself. That's something I know how to do. Will you teach me how to do it too?" Emma asked. "How to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous." Samuel looked down at this remarkable child who had already shown more courage than most adults would ever be called upon to display, and realized that she was asking him to become not just her protector, but her teacher in the moral complexities of justice and sacrifice. "Yes," he said, understanding that his promise encompassed far more than tactical training. "I'll teach you everything I know about fighting for what matters." That night, as Samuel cleaned his weapons and prepared for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided, he felt the weight of his military past settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar uniform. The Medal of Honor sat on his bedside table, its bronze and ribbon a reminder of the man he had once been and would need to become again. But the medal also represented something new, not just his own service and sacrifice, but his commitment to finishing the fight that John Morrison had started and ensuring that Emma and Tommy would inherit a world where justice was possible and courage was rewarded rather than punished. The Congressional Medal of Honor had been awarded to Colonel Samuel Creek for valor in battle, but it would be earned all over again by the mountain hermit who was preparing to defend his makeshift family against enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill children in pursuit of their criminal goals. As Samuel checked his rifle one final time and settled into his bedroll, he could hear the soft breathing of Emma and Tommy sleeping peacefully nearby, trusting in his ability to keep them safe from harm. Tomorrow would bring the test of that trust, and Samuel Creek, both the decorated war hero and the devoted father, was finally ready to meet it. The transformation of Samuel's mountain retreat from peaceful homestead to tactical fortress began before dawn on the morning. After his revelations to Emma, 15 years of military training, temporarily suppressed but never truly forgotten, reasserted itself as Samuel studied his property with the calculating eye of a man who understood that geography would determine the outcome of the coming battle. The cabin's location, which Samuel had originally chosen for its isolation and natural beauty, now revealed itself to possess significant strategic advantages. Built on a slight rise with clear sightlines in 3 directions, it commanded the natural approaches through the surrounding forest while offering multiple escape routes toward the higher elevations. The creek that provided their water also created a natural barrier that would force attackers to expose themselves while crossing, and the thick stands of pine trees offered concealment for defensive positions. Samuel spent the morning creating what he mentally termed his tactical map, a hand-drawn document that recorded every advantage and vulnerability of their position. He sketched the cabin's layout, marked the positions of natural cover, identified choke points where enemy movement could be restricted, and planned interlocking fields of fire that would allow him to defend their home against superior numbers. Emma proved to be an invaluable assistant in this reconnaissance, her child's perspective revealing details that Samuel's military mind might have overlooked. She knew which trees were strong enough to support a person's weight, which sections of the forest floor were soft enough to muffle footsteps, and which game trails might provide concealed approaches to their defensive perimeter. "The big rock behind the woodshed," Emma suggested as they studied the terrain to the north of the cabin. "Tommy and I used to play there, and there's a space underneath where you can hide and see everything coming up the main trail." Samuel examined the position and realized that Emma had identified what military tacticians would call a perfect observation post, protected, concealed, and offering excellent fields of observation without exposing the observer to enemy fire. He added the position to his map with a note about its tactical value, impressed once again by Emma's instinctive understanding of their situation. The afternoon was devoted to preparing defensive positions and stockpiling the supplies they would need to withstand a siege. Samuel moved ammunition, medical supplies, and emergency food stores to strategic locations around the property, creating hidden caches that could be accessed even if the main cabin became untenable. He reinforced the root cellar that would serve as the children's primary shelter, installing additional supports and ensuring that it had adequate ventilation. For extended occupation, Emma worked alongside him with the focused determination of someone who understood that their lives depended on thorough preparation. She helped move supplies, memorize the locations of hidden caches, and practice the emergency procedures that would govern their actions when the attack began. Her presence reminded Samuel constantly of what he was fighting to protect, but also of the burden of responsibility that came with involving children in tactical planning. Tommy presented more complex challenges. At 5 years old, he was too young to understand the full implications of their preparations, but old enough to sense the tension and urgency that now governed their daily routine. Samuel and Emma worked together to present their activities as an adventure game, teaching Tommy to hide quickly and quietly while framing the exercises as play rather than preparation for violence. "We're practicing being very good at hide and seek," Emma explained to her brother as they rehearsed emergency procedures for the third time that day. "Samuel is teaching us how to be the best hiders in the whole mountain." Tommy embraced these games with typical childhood enthusiasm, though Samuel noticed that the boy never let his doll out of his sight and had begun sleeping, pressed against Samuel's side with even greater intensity than before. Children might not understand tactical situations, but they possessed an instinctive awareness of danger that no amount of careful explanation could completely mask. The most difficult aspect of their preparations involved contingency planning for scenarios that Samuel hoped would never develop. He wrote letters for Emma and Tommy, documents that would explain their heritage, identify trustworthy contacts, and provide instructions for their care if he didn't survive the coming battle. These letters were sealed and hidden with the emergency supplies, insurance against the possibility that love and determination might not be enough to protect his makeshift family. Samuel also began teaching Emma more advanced survival skills, knowledge that she might need if they were forced to abandon the cabin and live off the land for extended periods. She learned to identify edible plants, to build concealed shelters, and to move through the forest without leaving tracks that could be followed by pursuers. These lessons were framed as interesting wilderness knowledge, but Emma understood their true purpose and approached them with the seriousness they deserved. As evening approached on their second day of preparation, Samuel made a discovery that changed his understanding of their tactical situation. While checking the perimeter defenses one final time, he found evidence that Garrett Welsh's men had been conducting surveillance of his property for longer than he had realized. Hidden in the tree line, partially concealed by fallen logs and natural debris, were the remains of a temporary camp, cold ashes from a carefully banked fire, impressions in the pine needles where men had slept, and most disturbing of all, a notebook containing detailed observations of the cabin's layout and the daily routines of its inhabitants. The notebook revealed that their enemies had been watching them for at least a week, documenting Samuel's movements, noting the children's outdoor activities, and planning their approach with professional thoroughness. The final entry, dated 2 days earlier, contained a chilling assessment. Target confirmed. 2 children match descriptions. Recommend immediate action. Samuel returned to the cabin with this intelligence, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. Welsh's men weren't planning a hasty assault based on limited information. They were preparing a carefully coordinated operation designed to capture the children with minimal risk to themselves. This suggested that they possessed both the resources and the expertise of experienced military or law enforcement personnel. Emma noticed the change in Samuel's demeanor immediately. "What did you find?" she asked quietly, positioning herself so that Tommy couldn't overhear their conversation. Samuel showed her the notebook, explaining what its contents revealed about their enemies' capabilities and intentions. Emma studied the careful handwriting and detailed sketches with the same analytical attention she brought to all serious matters, asking questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of tactical situations. "They've been watching us play," she said, pointing to an entry that described Tommy's games with his doll. "They know about our routines, about where we go and what we do each day, which means we need to change everything," Samuel replied. "From now on, we assume they're watching us every moment. We move differently, we act differently, and we never do anything that might give them additional advantages." The final phase of their preparation involved psychological readiness for the violence that was now inevitable. Samuel had killed men during his military service, but always in the context of open warfare, where the moral justification was clear and the legal authority was unquestioned. The situation was different. He would be acting without official sanction to protect children, who were not legally his responsibility, against men who probably carried credentials, identifying them as legitimate law enforcement officers. But as Samuel watched Emma help Tommy prepare for bed, listening to their quiet conversation about the adventures they would have when the hide-and-seek games were finished, he realized that legal authority and official sanction were luxuries that he couldn't afford to consider. John and Catherine Morrison had died because good men had failed to protect them from corruption, masquerading as legitimate business. Samuel would not allow their children to suffer the same fate, regardless of what laws or regulations might theoretically govern his actions. Emma seemed to understand the moral complexity of their situation without needing explicit explanation. "Papa always said that sometimes you have to choose between what's legal and what's right," she told Samuel as they completed their final security check of the evening. "He said that good people sometimes have to break bad laws to protect innocent people." Samuel was struck by the wisdom embedded in John Morrison's guidance to his daughter, and by Emma's ability to apply that wisdom to their current circumstances. Her father had prepared her not just for the practical challenges of surviving in a hostile world, but for the moral challenges of distinguishing between justice and law when the two were in conflict. That night, as Samuel settled into what might be his last peaceful sleep for some time, he found himself thinking about the hand-drawn map that now covered most of his kitchen table. The document represented more than just tactical planning. It was a visual representation of his commitment to defending the life that he and the children had built together. Every position marked on the map, every defensive advantage identified, every escape route planned, represented a choice to fight rather than flee, to risk everything rather than accept the gradual erosion of justice that had characterized his post-military years. The map was a declaration of war against the forces that had destroyed the Morrison family, drawn by a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. But the map also represented the transformation of a mountain hermit into a father willing to kill and die for his children's future. Samuel Creek, the decorated war hero, had served his country with distinction. But Samuel Creek, the makeshift parent, was preparing to serve a higher cause, the protection of innocence and the preservation of hope in a world that too often rewarded cruelty and punished courage. As he drifted toward sleep, Samuel could hear the soft breathing of Emma and Tommy in their beds nearby, trusting in his ability to keep them safe from the storm that was gathering around their small family. Tomorrow would bring the test of that trust, and the hand-drawn tactical map would guide him through what might be the most important battle of his life, not for territory or strategic advantage, but for the right of two orphaned children to grow up free from the shadows of their parents' killers. The map lay spread across the table like a promise, its careful lines and detailed annotations representing everything that Samuel had learned about love, loss, and the terrible mathematics of protecting what mattered. most in a world where good intentions were never enough, and courage was the only currency that retained its value when everything else had been stripped away. They came at dawn, just as Samuel had expected they would, moving through the forest with the disciplined precision of men who had done this kind of work before. Samuel spotted them from his observation post behind the woodshed, 4 riders approaching along the main trail, their movements coordinated and their weapons visible but not immediately threatening. These were not random criminals or opportunistic bounty hunters, but professionals who understood the value of appearing legitimate until the moment they chose to reveal their true intentions. Samuel recognized Garrett Welsh immediately from the descriptions that Catherine Morrison had provided during her final hours. A tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, Welsh rode at the front of the group with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. His companions were younger men, probably hired gunmen with enough military or law enforcement experience to follow orders and execute plans with competent efficiency. The approach was textbook perfect. 3 men advancing along the obvious route, while the 4th circled wide to cover the cabin's rear approaches. They moved within hailing distance and stopped, Welsh raising his hand in a gesture that could be interpreted as either greeting or warning, depending on the observer's perspective. "Samuel Creek," Welsh called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "We need to talk to you about the children you're harboring. We're here on official business, and we'd prefer to handle this matter without unnecessary complications." Samuel remained concealed, studying the men and their positioning while considering his response. Welsh's use of the word harboring was carefully chosen, implying criminal activity on Samuel's part and providing legal justification for whatever actions might follow. The reference to official business was similarly calculated, designed to suggest legitimate authority while remaining vague enough to avoid specific legal commitments. Emma was hidden in the root cellar with Tommy, following the emergency procedures they had practiced repeatedly over the past few days. Samuel had given her strict instructions to remain concealed regardless of what she might hear. But he knew that her protective instincts toward her brother would be tested if the situation escalated to violence. "What kind of official business?" Samuel called back, remaining hidden while gathering information about his enemy's intentions and capabilities. "Railroad business," Welsh replied, his tone suggesting patience that was strictly limited. "We're investigating the theft of company property by a woman named Catherine Morrison. We have reason to believe that you're currently caring for her children, and we need to take them into custody for questioning about their mother's criminal activities." The lie was smoothly delivered and probably convincing to anyone who didn't know the true circumstances of the Morrison family's persecution. Samuel felt a surge of admiration for John Morrison's courage in opposing men who were clearly skilled at manipulating legal and social systems to serve their criminal purposes. "I'm not harboring anyone," Samuel replied, buying time while he assessed the tactical situation. "I live alone up here, and I haven't seen any woman or children matching your description." Welsh's response came after a pause that suggested consultation with his companions. "Mr. Creek, we have witnesses who saw you in Bear Creek purchasing children's clothing and medical supplies. We also have evidence that you've been caring for 2 children for several months. I'm going to need you to step out where we can see you, and then we're going to need to search your property." Samuel recognized the escalation in Welsh's tone and realized that the negotiation phase was ending. These men had come prepared to take Emma and Tommy by force, and they were simply following a script designed to provide legal cover for whatever violence might be necessary to accomplish their mission. "I'm not stepping out, and you're not searching anything," Samuel called back, his own voice hardening as he shifted into the tactical mindset that had served him during his military career. "You're trespassing on private property, and I'm ordering you to leave immediately." The reaction was swift and predictable. Welsh gestured to his men, who immediately began moving to surround the cabin while maintaining the pretense of legitimate law enforcement activity. Samuel watched them deploy with professional competence. noting their use of cover and their coordination of movement. "Samuel Creek," Welsh called out again, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who was finished with negotiation. "You're interfering with a federal investigation, and you're harboring fugitives from justice. If you don't surrender those children immediately, we'll be forced to take them by other means." Samuel's response was to put a rifle bullet into the tree 6 inches from Welsh's head, the crack of the shot echoing off the surrounding mountains and establishing new rules for their interaction. The men immediately sought cover, their professional discipline evident in the speed and efficiency of their movements. "The next shot won't be a warning," Samuel called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had been in this situation before and understood its probable outcome. "You gentlemen have 5 minutes to mount up and ride out of here before I start shooting to kill." What followed was a tense pause during which Welsh and his men assessed their tactical situation and realized that they were facing more than just a stubborn homesteader. Samuel's shot placement had been precise enough to demonstrate serious marksmanship skills, and his positioning had been chosen to provide maximum defensive advantage while minimizing his exposure to return fire. Welsh's next communication revealed the depth of his knowledge about Samuel's background and the extent of his preparation for this confrontation. "Colonel Creek, we know who you are and what you're capable of. We also know that you're wanted for desertion and insubordination. You can make this easy on yourself by surrendering the children and coming with us to face the charges that have been pending against you for 15 years. Samuel felt a cold clarity settle over his mind as he realized that this was no longer about Emma and Tommy's immediate safety, but about the final resolution of conflicts that had been building for more than a decade. Welsh's men weren't just criminals, hiding behind false authority. They were part of the same network of corruption that had destroyed John Morrison and driven Samuel into exile. "The charges against me were fabricated by corrupt officers who were trying to cover up their own crimes," Samuel replied, his voice carrying across the clearing with deadly calm. "And the children you're trying to take are under my protection. Any attempt to harm them will be met with lethal force." The shooting began moments later, not with the dramatic confrontation that Samuel had expected, but with the methodical professional violence of men who understood that talk had served its purpose and action was now required. Welsh's men began a coordinated assault on the cabin, using covering fire and tactical movement to advance, while maintaining pressure on Samuel's defensive positions. Samuel's response drew on 15 years of suppressed tactical knowledge and the desperate motivation of a father protecting his children. He moved between prepared positions with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent days studying the terrain and planning for exactly this scenario. His return fire was accurate and disciplined, designed not just to repel the immediate attack, but to demonstrate that any attempt to take Emma and Tommy would cost more than Welsh's men were prepared to pay. The first casualty came when one of Welsh's gunmen attempted to flank the cabin through the creek bed, exposing himself to fire from Samuel's carefully prepared position behind the large boulder that Emma had identified. Samuel's shot was precise and final, dropping the man into the shallow water and sending a clear message about the cost of underestimating their defensive capabilities. Welsh himself proved to be both tactically competent and personally dangerous, directing his men's movements while maintaining his own position of relative safety. But Samuel could see that the criminal's confidence was beginning to erode as he realized that his professional gunmen were facing an opponent who understood military tactics and terrain advantages better than they did. The battle settled into a pattern of advance and repulsion, with Welsh's men probing for weaknesses in Samuel's defenses, while Samuel methodically eliminated their advantages and reduced their numbers. The sound of gunfire echoed off the surrounding mountains, but Samuel knew that no help would come. They were too far from any settlement, and Welsh's men had probably taken precautions to ensure that their activities wouldn't be interrupted by outside interference. As the morning wore on, Samuel found himself thinking not about victory or defeat, but about Emma's mother's wedding ring, which she had pressed into his hands on the night she died. Catherine Morrison had entrusted him with more than just her children's physical safety. She had given him the responsibility for ensuring that Emma and Tommy would grow up to understand the difference between justice and law, between courage and violence, and between love and mere obligation. The ring, now hanging from a chain around Samuel's neck, seemed to grow heavier with each shot fired and each tactical decision made. It represented not just Catherine's final gift, but Samuel's transformation from a man who had run away from responsibility into someone who would kill and die to protect the family that had been entrusted to his care. Welsh's voice carried across the battlefield as the assault intensified, his words revealing both desperation and determination. "You can't hold out forever, Creek. We have more men coming, and all we need is those children. Surrender them now, and we'll let you walk away from this." Samuel's response was another precisely placed shot that forced Welsh to seek better cover, followed by words that carried the authority of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "The children stay with me, Welsh, and if you want them, you'll have to come through me to get them." The turning point came when Emma made a decision that transformed the entire nature of their battle. Despite Samuel's explicit instructions to remain hidden in the root cellar until the fighting ended, she'd been listening to the gunfire and Welsh's increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate Samuel's surrender. When she heard Welsh threaten to burn the cabin to force them out, Emma knew that her passive obedience might cost all their lives. Moving with the careful stealth that Samuel had taught her during their tactical preparation, Emma slipped out of the root cellar and made her way to the cabin's main room. There, folded carefully in her mother's wooden chest, was the handmade quilt that Catherine Morrison had sewn during the final months of her pregnancy with Tommy, a beautiful creation that depicted scenes from their family's life together and represented everything that Welsh's men were trying to destroy. Emma understood that the quilt was more than just a family heirloom. It was a symbol of the love and hope that her parents had tried to preserve. And it was exactly the kind of evidence that might convince neutral observers of the truth about their family's persecution. More importantly, it was large enough and distinctive enough to serve as a signal that could be seen from a considerable distance. Samuel first noticed the quilt when Emma appeared at the cabin's front window, holding the colorful fabric above her head like a flag. His initial reaction was terror for her safety and anger at her disobedience. But as he watched her careful movements, he began to understand what she was attempting to accomplish. Emma called out to Welsh in a clear, strong voice that carried all the moral authority of her 8 years and the tragic wisdom that had been forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. "Mr. Welsh, my name is Emma Morrison, and this is my family's quilt. My mama made it to remember all the good times we had before you killed my papa." The effect of Emma's appearance and words was immediate and dramatic. Welsh's men hesitated in their assault, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of shooting at a child who was openly identifying herself as one of their targets. Welsh himself seemed stunned by Emma's courage and the moral clarity of her accusation. "Emma, get back inside," Samuel called urgently. But Emma shook her head with the determination that had characterized her response to every challenge they had faced together. "I'm tired of hiding," she replied, her young voice carrying across the battlefield with remarkable steadiness. "These men killed my parents, and they want to kill me and Tommy too. But we're not going to let them, because we have Samuel, and Samuel knows how to fight for what's right." Samuel felt something profound shift in his understanding of their battle as he realized that Emma had transformed their defensive action into something approaching a moral crusade. She was no longer just a victim to be protected, but a witness to injustice who was demanding accountability from her parents, killers. Welsh's response revealed both his desperation and his recognition that Emma's public testimony was destroying the legal fiction that had justified his actions. "Emma, we're not here to hurt you," he called out with forced gentleness. "We're here to take you somewhere safe, where you'll be properly cared for and protected." Emma's laugh was bitter and far too adult for her years. "You're lying, just like you lied about Papa stealing railroad property. We know who you are, and we know what you did. And now other people will know too. Because Samuel is a war hero, and people will believe him when he tells them the truth about you." Samuel realized that Emma was taking an enormous risk by revealing her identity so publicly. But he also understood that her courage was forcing Welsh to confront the moral bankruptcy of his position. The criminal had come to eliminate witnesses to his crimes. But Emma was transforming herself into a public accuser, whose testimony would carry far more weight than Welsh had anticipated. The battle resumed with increased intensity, but now it had a different character. Welsh's men were no longer fighting to capture children quietly. They were fighting to silence a witness who had already begun exposing their crimes to anyone within hearing distance. Their assault became more desperate and less disciplined, driven by the recognition that failure would mean exposure and eventual prosecution. Samuel used this change in his enemy's tactical approach to his advantage, launching a coordinated counterattack that drew on all his military experience and intimate knowledge of the terrain. He moved between defensive positions with deadly efficiency, his rifle fire precise and devastating as he eliminated Welsh's remaining men one by one. But it was Emma's continued presence at the cabin window, holding her mother's quilt and calling out the truth about her family's persecution, that provided the moral force that transformed their battle from simple survival into something approaching justice. Her voice carried across the mountains like a bell, clear and unwavering in its demand for accountability. When Welsh made his final desperate attempt to reach the cabin by charging across the open ground, Samuel was ready for him. The two men faced each other across 20 yards of blood-stained snow, each understanding that only one of them would survive to tell the story of what had happened on this mountain. "You can't win this." "Creak!" Welsh gasped, his own rifle trained on Samuel's position. "Even if you kill me, there are others who will come for those children. The network is too big, too well connected for one man to fight." Samuel's response came not just from his own voice, but from the accumulated courage of John Morrison, the dying faith of Catherine Morrison, and the remarkable strength of the 8-year-old girl who was still holding her family's quilt in the cabin window. "Maybe the network is too big for one man to fight," he replied, his rifle steady and his aim true. "But it's not too big for a family to fight. And that's what we are now, a family." The final shots were fired almost simultaneously. But Samuel's years of tactical training and intimate knowledge of his defensive position gave him the advantage he needed. Welsh fell forward into the snow, his rifle spinning away from his lifeless hands, while Samuel remained standing to see the end of the battle that had begun with a dying woman's plea to save her children. Emma emerged from the cabin carrying her mother's quilt, which she spread carefully over the ground beside Samuel as if she were preparing for a picnic rather than surveying a battlefield. Tommy appeared moments later, clutching his carved doll and looking around at the scene with the wide-eyed wonder of a child who understood that something important had happened but wasn't quite sure what it meant. "Are the bad men gone?" Tommy asked, his small voice barely audible in the sudden silence that had settled over the mountain. Samuel knelt beside the boy, gathering both children into his arms and holding them close, while he struggled to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished together. "Yes, Tommy, the bad men are gone and they won't be coming back." Emma pulled back slightly to look into Samuel's face, her expression serious but no longer shadowed by the fear that had characterized her demeanor since her parents' death. "What happens now?" she asked. "Are we safe?" Samuel looked down at these two remarkable children who had shown more courage than most adults would ever be called upon to display, and realized that their safety depended not just on the elimination of immediate threats, but on the creation of a legal and social framework that would protect them from future persecution. "Now we tell the truth," he replied, understanding that their battle had been won not just through superior tactics and determination, but through Emma's moral courage in demanding public accountability for her parents' deaths. "We tell everyone what really happened to your family, and we make sure that the men responsible for these crimes can never hurt anyone else." The handmade quilt, spread across the mountain snow like a declaration of hope, represented everything that Catherine Morrison had tried to preserve through her dying plea to save her children. It depicted scenes of family love and domestic happiness, images of a life that Welsh and his associates had tried to destroy but had ultimately failed to eliminate. As Samuel helped Emma and Tommy gather their belongings for the journey down to Bear Creek, where they would begin the process of seeking legal justice for the Morrison family, he realized that the quilt had become something more than just a family heirloom. It was a flag of victory, a symbol of the triumph of love over hatred, and a promise that the family they had created together would endure long after the echoes of gunfire had faded from the mountain air. The battle was over, but the war for justice was just beginning, and as they prepared to carry their story to a world that needed to hear it, Samuel understood that the most important victory had been won not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of two children who had learned that courage and love could overcome even the most powerful forces of corruption and evil. 6 months after the battle that had ended, Garrett Welsh's criminal enterprise, Samuel stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching Emma teach Tommy how to identify edible plants in their expanded garden. The mountain air still carried the crisp promise of approaching autumn, but the atmosphere around their home had been transformed, from one of siege-like vigilance to something approaching the peaceful domesticity that Samuel had once shared with Sarah. The legal proceedings that had followed their victory had been complex and far-reaching, involving federal prosecutors, railroad investigators, and a congressional committee that had spent weeks documenting the extent of the corruption that John Morrison had died trying to expose. Emma's testimony, delivered with the same clear moral courage she had shown during the battle, had provided the foundation for criminal charges against more than a dozen officials and businessmen who had profited from the systematic exploitation of homesteading families. Samuel's own legal situation had been resolved through a presidential pardon that acknowledged both his military service and his role in protecting the Morrison children from criminal persecution. The Congressional Medal of Honor, which had spent 15 years hidden in a box beneath his bed, now hung in a place of honor on their cabin wall, not as a monument to past glory, but as a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that justice sometimes required from ordinary people. The formal adoption papers had been signed 3 weeks earlier, in a courthouse ceremony that had attracted attention from newspapers throughout the Colorado Territory. Emma Morrison Creek and Thomas Morrison Creek were now legally Samuel's children, their new names reflecting both their heritage and their future. The proceedings had been expedited by sympathetic officials who understood the unique circumstances of their case and the importance of providing stability for children who had already endured far too much uncertainty. But the most significant changes had been emotional rather than legal. Emma had begun to smile more frequently, her natural intelligence and curiosity no longer overshadowed by the defensive wariness that had characterized her demeanor during their months of hiding. She had grown several inches during their time together, and Samuel had been forced to admit that his skills as a seamstress were inadequate for the challenge of keeping a growing girl properly clothed. Tommy had experienced his own transformation, evolving from a traumatized 5-year-old who spoke primarily to his carved doll into a confident, talkative boy who filled their cabin with laughter and endless questions about everything from wildlife behavior to the mechanics of Samuel's pocket watch. The doll remained important to him, but it was no longer a substitute for human connection. It was simply a cherished toy that accompanied him on the adventures that now characterized his daily life. Samuel himself had discovered that parenthood was far more complex and rewarding than his military experience had prepared him to understand. The skills that had made him an effective commander, tactical thinking, attention to detail, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure had proved useful in raising children. But they were insufficient for the emotional demands of helping two young people heal from trauma while building confidence for their future. The cabin had been expanded to include proper bedrooms for the children, a larger kitchen that could accommodate family meals, and a sitting room where they gathered each evening for the stories and conversations that had become the foundation of their shared life. Samuel had also constructed a workshop where he taught Emma and Tommy basic carpentry skills, passing on practical knowledge while creating opportunities for the kind of quiet conversation that deepened their understanding of each other. Their daily routines had evolved to reflect their new status as a legal family rather than refugees hiding from persecution. Emma attended school in Bear Creek 3 days a week, riding down the mountain with Samuel and staying with the doctor's family while she received the formal education that would prepare her for whatever future she chose to pursue. Tommy was still too young for formal schooling, but Samuel had begun teaching him to read using the Bible and the collection of adventure novels that had entertained Samuel during his years of solitude. The family photograph that had been taken during their adoption ceremony sat prominently on the kitchen table, a formal portrait that captured something essential about their transformation from strangers thrown together by tragedy into people who had chosen to love each other despite having no biological obligation to do so. Samuel wore his dress uniform for the photograph, the Congressional Medal of Honor visible on his chest, while Emma and Tommy flanked him in their finest clothes, their faces radiant with the kind of happiness that could only come from finally feeling safe and wanted. But perhaps the most important change had been in Samuel's relationship with his own past. The guilt and self-recrimination that had driven him into 15 years of exile had been replaced by a sense of purpose and accomplishment that came from using his skills and experience to protect people who deserved protection. He had learned that running away from responsibility was not the same as avoiding it, and that some obligations transcended personal preference and demanded the best that a person could offer. Emma had proved to be remarkably perceptive about Samuel's emotional journey, often making observations that revealed her understanding of the healing that had taken place for all of them. "You're not sad anymore," she told him one evening as they worked together preparing dinner. "When we first came here, you were sad all the time, even when you were being nice to us. But now you're happy, and it shows in your face." Samuel had been struck by the accuracy of her observation and by the realization that his transformation had been as dramatic as theirs. The man who had buried his faith beneath his cabin floorboards had gradually rediscovered not just his belief in God, but his faith in the possibility that good people could make a meaningful difference in a world that often seemed designed to reward cruelty and punish kindness. The wooden cross that had belonged to his mother had been retrieved from its hiding place and now occupied a small shrine in their sitting room, surrounded by photographs of both Samuel's and the children's deceased parents. The arrangement represented not just religious faith, but a broader belief in the continuity of love across generations and the responsibility that the living bore to honor the memory of those who had sacrificed for their welfare. Community acceptance had come gradually but genuinely, as the people of Bear Creek had come to understand the true circumstances of the Morrison family's persecution and Samuel's role in protecting the children from criminal violence. The heroic narrative that had emerged from the congressional investigations had transformed Samuel from a mysterious hermit into something approaching a local legend. Though he remained uncomfortable with public attention and preferred the quiet recognition that came from being known as a good father to 2 remarkable children. Emma's teacher, Miss Patterson, had become a regular visitor to their cabin, ostensibly to discuss Emma's educational progress, but actually to provide the kind of feminine guidance that Samuel knew both children needed as they grew older. Her presence also offered Samuel the companionship of another adult who shared his commitment to the children's welfare and understood the unique challenges of their unconventional family arrangement. The economic foundation of their new life had been secured through a combination of the reward money that Samuel had received for exposing the railroad corruption and the pension that had been restored to him when his military record was cleared of all charges. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable enough to focus on the children's education and development without the constant worry about basic survival that had characterized Samuel's years of solitude. As autumn deepened into winter, Samuel found himself looking forward to the season that had once represented months of isolation and forced introspection. This year, the approaching cold meant cozy evenings by the fire, family traditions that were still being established, and the kind of domestic contentment that he had thought was lost forever when Sarah died. Emma had suggested that they invite Miss Patterson to share Christmas dinner with them, a proposal that Samuel had accepted with enthusiasm despite his lingering discomfort with social obligations. Tommy had begun planning elaborate decorations for their Christmas tree, drawing pictures of the ornaments he wanted to create and practicing the songs that Emma was teaching him for their holiday celebration. The pocket watch that had belonged to John Morrison now occupied a place of honor on Samuel's bedside table, its steady ticking a constant reminder of the debt he owed to a good man who had died fighting for justice. But the watch also represented the passage of time that was transforming their makeshift family into something permanent and valuable. Each day, adding to the accumulation of shared experiences and mutual affection that would define their future together. On quiet evenings, when the children were absorbed in their books or games, and Samuel had completed the daily tasks that kept their household functioning, he would sometimes find himself thinking about Catherine Morrison's final plea to save her babies. He had kept that promise in ways that he couldn't have imagined during those desperate moments when she lay dying in his cabin. But he had also discovered that saving the children had saved him as, well, the man who had once believed that love led inevitably to loss had learned that some kinds of love were strong enough to survive tragedy and patient enough to grow, despite the most unpromising circumstances. Emma and Tommy had not replaced the family that Samuel had lost with Sarah, but they had created something new and equally precious, a bond forged in crisis, but sustained by choice, a commitment that deepened with each passing day and promised to endure for whatever challenges the future might bring. As Samuel watched the first snow of the season begin to fall on their mountain home, he understood that Catherine Morrison's dying words had become a prophecy rather than just a desperate plea. He had indeed saved her babies, but in the process of protecting them, they had saved him as well, from the isolation that had been slowly killing his spirit, from the guilt that had poisoned his memories of service and sacrifice, and from the bitter conviction that good people were destined to lose everything they valued to forces beyond their control. The family photograph on their kitchen table captured more than just a moment in time. It documented the transformation of three broken people into something whole and hopeful. Samuel's face in the portrait showed the peace that came from finally understanding his purpose in life, while Emma and Tommy's expressions radiated the confidence of children who knew they were loved unconditionally and protected absolutely. Emma had begun keeping a journal, following Samuel's example of recording daily events and seasonal changes. But her entries focused on the small moments of happiness that characterized their life together. Tommy's delight in learning to read his first simple sentences, Samuel's patient instruction in practical skills, and her own growing confidence in a future that held promise rather than threat. Her writing revealed a wisdom and emotional maturity that impressed the adults who encountered it. But it also captured the essential childhood wonder that her traumatic experiences hadn't been able to destroy. Tommy's development had been equally remarkable, though expressed in characteristically boyish ways. He had become Samuel's eager assistant in all outdoor tasks, chattering constantly about his observations of wildlife behavior and his theories about how various mechanical devices functioned. His relationship with his carved doll had evolved into something more sophisticated. The toy was now part of elaborate storytelling games that incorporated the real adventures of their family, alongside fantastical elements that revealed Tommy's creative imagination. The community connections that had developed around their family represented a kind of social healing that extended beyond their household. Bear Creek had rallied around the Morrison children's story, not just out of sympathy for their losses, but out of recognition that their courage had exposed corruption that had affected many families throughout the territory. The congressional investigations had resulted in compensation for dozens of homesteaders who had lost property to fraudulent railroad schemes, making Emma and Tommy heroes to people they had never met. But perhaps the most significant development had been Samuel's gradual acceptance of the possibility that his family might continue to grow. Miss Patterson's frequent visits had evolved into something approaching courtship, though conducted with the careful respect for the children's emotional needs that characterized all aspects of their unconventional household. Emma had been the first to suggest that Samuel might benefit from adult companionship, displaying the same protective instincts toward him that he had shown toward her and Tommy. "You get lonely sometimes," she had observed during one of their evening conversations. "Not sad like you used to be, but lonely in a different way. Miss Patterson makes you smile the way you make us smile when you take care of us." Samuel had been amazed by Emma's perceptiveness and touched by her concern for his emotional welfare. The 8-year-old girl who had once been forced to protect her younger brother from adult violence was now taking responsibility for ensuring that the adults in her life were properly cared for and supported. The approaching Christmas season had provided a focus for family traditions that were still being established, but already felt essential to their shared identity. Emma had taken charge of planning their celebration, consulting with Samuel about practical matters while making decisions about decorations and special foods that reflected her memories of holidays with her birth parents. Her choices revealed both her desire to honor her original family's traditions and her commitment to creating new customs that would belong specifically to their reconstructed household. Tommy's anticipation of Christmas had reached fever pitch, expressed through endless questions about Santa Claus, detailed planning for cookie recipes, and ambitious artistic projects that were intended to decorate every surface of their cabin. His enthusiasm was infectious, drawing Samuel into preparations that he had never imagined himself undertaking, but found surprisingly enjoyable. The gift-giving aspect of the holiday had presented unique challenges for a family whose members had no experience of normal domestic economics. Samuel wanted to provide Emma and Tommy with presents that would reflect both his love for them and his understanding of their individual personalities and interests. Emma had requested books, specifically adventure stories that featured brave girls and tales of exploration in exotic locations. Tommy had been less specific in his requests, though his fascination with mechanical devices suggested that he would appreciate toys that could be taken apart and reassembled, but the most meaningful gifts were those that couldn't be purchased. The security of knowing that their family was permanent and legally protected, the confidence that came from being valued and respected by their community, and the hope that characterized their daily interactions with each other and the wider world. As Christmas Eve approached, Samuel found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point of domestic contentment and social acceptance. The man who had once buried a wooden cross beneath his cabin floor to symbolize his rejection of faith and hope was now helping his children prepare for a religious holiday that celebrated the possibility of redemption and new beginnings. The evening routine that had evolved over their months together Dinner followed by storytelling, quiet conversation, and the children's bedtime prayers had become the anchor of Samuel's emotional life. Listening to Emma and Tommy thank God for their safety, their family and their home, Samuel had gradually rediscovered his own capacity for gratitude and faith in the fundamental goodness of existence. The final entry in Samuel's journal for that year captured something essential about their transformation from strangers, united by tragedy, into a family, bound by choice and sustained by love. Today, Emma helped Tommy write a letter to his birth parents, telling them about our life together and assuring them that he remembers their love, even as he grows to love his new family. The wisdom of children continues to amaze me, and I am grateful every day for the privilege of helping these remarkable young people grow into the adults they are meant to become. Outside their cabin, the mountain snow continued to fall, covering the landscape in the pristine whiteness that had once symbolized Samuel's isolation from human connection. But now the snow represented not separation, but protection, not loneliness, but the peaceful privacy that allowed their unusual family to flourish without interference from those who might not understand the circumstances that had brought them together. The last photograph in their family album, taken on Christmas morning, showed three people who had learned that love was not diminished by tragedy, but strengthened by the choice to care for each other despite having no obligation to do so. Samuel's face reflected the peace of a man who had found his purpose, while Emma and Tommy radiated the joy of children who knew they were cherished absolutely and protected completely. In years to come, that photograph would serve as evidence of the miraculous transformation that could occur when broken people chose to heal together rather than suffer alone. But on that snowy Christmas morning, it was simply a record of the happiness that filled a mountain cabin, where a dying woman's plea to save her babies had become the foundation of a love story that would endure for generations to come.